Welcome everyone to the Canadian Ecopsychology Network monthly virtual gathering. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of CEN. Today, we're going to hear from Rhian Daniel about cultural appropriation, and I've invited Linda Bazell to introduce him. Linda?
Thanks, Carol. So I'm really happy to introduce Rhian, and I'm going to read a short biography that's pretty interesting. Rhian was born in Australia to Italian World War II refugees. Excuse me, he spent the majority of his early years in various remote locations of Australia. Having no brothers, he spent the majority of his time playing alone in nature, developing relationships with animals and plants, yet unaware of the psychological aspects of this relationship. After being kicked out of high school when he was 16, Rhian began his own journey, unobstructed by family, societal, or cultural rules. He lived in 6 different countries and traveled extensively, journeying for almost 20 years. Upon returning to Australia and his childhood nature environments, he rediscovered a concept of self with a capital S. This led to an educational redirection from postgraduate medicine to transpersonal psychology, somatic, and nature-based practices. His Ph.D. dissertation at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco was a multifaceted examination of the appropriateness of the wilderness rite of passage ritual for modern Western participants. I was delighted to be part of his dissertation committee, and I'm really glad to welcome Dr. Daniels.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Carol. Appreciate it. I'll go to share screen now as I start the presentation. So that little intro allows me to skip a couple of things here, but Linda, it was great having you as part of my committee as well. I just wish you were close and I could talk to you more often to tap into your wisdom. So as Linda said, I explored the basically the place and appropriateness of a wilderness rite of passage ritual in modern Western society. And probably a little bit of history is necessary at this point. When I first began my postgrad studies, I really had no idea what my dissertation was going to be about. I wasn't actually even familiar with these rituals, but I was interested in nature a lot. That always was a big thing for me. And I was also really interested in Feldenkrais and his methods that he created. So I was very interested in body-orientated practices. Now, I don't actually recall when I first heard or discovered these rite of passage rituals, but at some point I definitely was hooked. I became hooked on it. I thought it was a godsend. It was everything I was looking for, and it was perfect for my dissertation journey. So I researched different programs, and I went ahead and undertook my own ritual with an organization in Northern California. And the ritual was phenomenal, but I definitely found there were pieces missing. But I figured as I gained more experience and go through the training that these pieces would fall into place. So then I undertook the training. It was roughly over 2 to 3 years. It was a lot of didactic involved in it. There was apprenticing, being observed as a guide and then guiding. And once I completed, I was contracted as a guide with the organization, did all my training with as well. But one thing I did find, even as I went further and further on, the initial pieces that I thought were missing when I completed my first ritual, they never actually came. They never actually fell into place, and that caused a little bit of confusion for me. It was like, why aren't these falling into place? So as I was going along simultaneously with my postgrad studies and finalizing my dissertation topic, it went from exploring the actual vision aspect, and I use that term vision very loosely, to exploring the actual program itself and really exploring how it fits in and if it's appropriate or not. So my personal discoveries, as well as discoveries from a lot of other people who have undergone these rituals or people who have studied them, and there are not a lot of studies on these, but there's a lot of transpersonal experiences from participants, and I personally have never heard or encountered an individual that hasn't had some kind of transpersonal experience. I'm not saying they're not out there, but I just haven't encountered one yet. So they're phenomenal for the experiences. However, from my training and my experiences, there are large amounts of Native American aspects that had nothing to do with my background or any of the participants, nor that of the guide. Consequently, there was significant cultural appropriation. And the way I call it the triple-edged sword is that the third edge is the missed opportunity for these participants. So when I looked over my entire ritual program and I looked into aspects that I thought were culturally appropriated to some degree, not necessarily 100% or anything like that, these are all the different parts that I basically had aspects of cultural appropriation. Now, the amount or degree that they're culturally appropriated really alters according to the permeability of the moral fabric which is filtered. But I think herein lies an inherent complication and problem with cultural appropriation is that more anything, it's governed by moral obligation, and that can vary greatly. Not through people's ill will or anything like that, but it's one of those things that are not written in black and white. But summarizing what I found from my experiences, and this is what I wrote up in a very early copy of my dissertation, I felt as if it was as if a perfect fluid was poured into a perfect vessel that could not hold the perfect fluid perfectly. And so it was a lot of struggle trying to determine why it couldn't. If both things are perfect, where's the missing piece still? Now, as I went through my dissertation process, I came across this quote by Jung, and this is from an ancient Chinese proverb they use. And he says, the wrong man uses the right means works in the wrong way. So that I felt was really the same as what I was saying in my comment as well. So that really resonated. And Jung's actually a big part of my dissertation. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point? And why are we engaging in cultural appropriation? So one of the things I explored was the idea of human nature unity. Whenever I was looking at Indigenous people and that, there was this great unity between the Indigenous people and nature. It was one. There was no dualism or anything like that. It was just one. So I looked into Western people, the Western society's background, and started sort of going back. Now, simultaneously, what I did is I looked at Jung's God image, which changed as well. Now, one of the things that Jung was saying is about the God image. He says the history of Western man can be viewed as a history of its God images. The primary formulations of how mankind orients itself to the basic questions of life, its mysteries. So it's important to look at our spirituality connection to nature, where it changes, what's going on, and sort of really look at where did we come from without sort of making some kind of assumption. So if we go back, and one of the first steps was the Paleolithic era and animism. And there was an era of living in harmony with wild nature. And it wasn't wild. Now, it's a term that was a quote from Olschlager. And they use a lot of these terms, wild, wilderness, to really resonate, I think, with Western society now, how we see things now and how we describe things. Because in Native American tradition, there is no wild, there's not a term for that. Everything comes under nature. The connection with nature is as one, that term nature. So there's not a sense of wild or wilderness. Now, going into Neolithic and matriarchy was the next step, and you find a lot of Indigenous cultures kind of are in both of these, because a lot of Indigenous cultures were agricultural cultures as well. They developed techniques working with the land to sustain as much as they could from their environment without having to move on and be so much nomadic to go with where the food was, which is more in that earlier stage, Paleolithic stage. Now, in step 3, there was a transitional period, which Jung said was here we had hierarchical polytheism. Now, there's some things, I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to go through the most important parts. So suddenly here, animals are no longer equal. So animism was gone. The priest replaces the shaman. So now we had our head of spirituality no longer connected to the earth, no longer one with the earth and all the natural environment. So there was connection with the earth through spirituality was being cut off there. We also had the masculine concept was beginning to displace the feminine concept. Then we go into 4, modern religion, and this was what Jung called tribal monotheism. This is kind of the era in early Hebrews where it was kind of like, we are the people. So religion was very tribal, it wasn't spread far, but here it became, nature was God's creation for human benefit, and man was superior to all of nature. And then our modern era, monotheism. So here we can, our modern religions are really open to anyone to join and to, it doesn't matter what you're born as or programmed in early, you can change your religious preferences. But here, some of the significant things here was the scientific industrial revolution was occurring. We had significant growth of Christianity worldwide, and we also determined earlier that we no longer had the shaman, we had the priest, so that this connection with nature grew more and more and more. Nature becomes material, it's a fuel for economic growth. So nature is now separate from humans, existing for human exploitation. And there you can start to see where nature really becomes separate from humans, this whole idea of nature being wild, or the whole idea of wilderness. And if you look up a lot of the descriptions of wilderness in the various dictionaries, there's a lot of connections that we make in Western society now in the dictionaries where wilderness and nature, they're basically the same in some of the descriptions, but there's multiple descriptions. But I think the most appropriate one, and the one I really considered through my dissertation, was wilderness being a state of mind or a psychological disposition, not to do with nature itself. So human nature unity. So Henderson wrote this: nature has lost her divinity, yet the spirit is unsure and unsatisfied. Hence, any true cure for the neurosis of that time would have to awaken both spirit and nature to a new life. The relevance of this theme for us today may be that it is a problem we are still trying to solve on too personal psychological level or on a purely cultural level without fully realizing it is at bottom a religious problem and not a psychological or social problem at all. So I think that's really significant when we look at these practices, how we're using them and where our connections are with nature, especially if we feel very connected with nature. How is that connection there and how is it being disconnected? And going back a couple of steps, a lot of it has to do with religion. And Jung was of the same belief here of the problems with religion and its disconnection from nature. So Jungian religion, degenerate religion, corrupted by worldliness and mob instincts. I could probably leave it there. However, there is a religious sentimentality instead of mnemosyne of divine experience. This is the well-known characteristic of a religion that has lost its living mystery. It is readily understandable that such a religion is incapable of giving help or having any other moral effect. So when you go through, there was one step that I didn't quite include in those 5 steps of the human nature unity and looking at Jung's idea of the God image. There's also a sixth step, which he considers individuation. So it may be the process. We no longer have this established religious backdrop that connects us, that keeps us connected with nature in a real, authentic, unifying manner. So maybe it's what Jung said, is that it's through individuation now that we re-establish that. So because Native Americans and Native American practices played a big part in my dissertation, obviously it's filtered through here into this little discussion also. Now there is no such thing, this was reckoned, let me just grab my note here on this one. Excuse me for one sec. So there's no such thing as Christian civilization. I believe that Christianity and modern civilization are opposed and irreconcilable, and that the spirit of Christianity and of our ancient religion is essentially the same. So this was written by Charles Eastman, and those two words, those two names down the bottom there, I'm not going to try to pronounce them because I don't know the language and I feel like I'd be insulting him and the people by butchering these words. But these were two of his names, and obviously in their tradition is that when you went through a life change, you changed your name as well. But Eastman, he was a mixed blood Santee Dakota Native American. He graduated from Dartmouth College and he went on in 1987 and went on to graduate from medical school at Boston University. And he spread his life significantly between that of Native Americans and non-Indian culture, as he called it. And he basically did that for 25 years, trying to bridge the two to help them sort of live in harmony. But he said himself, he believed he was unsuccessful. If you're not familiar with Charles Eastman, there's a mini-series made called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, where he's one of the 4 main characters. And it gives a good understanding of who he is and his involvement with both cultures. So when he says something like this, it's very significant. And also he's written quite a few books. And if you read his books and you read the way he writes, you can see his heart is very much Native American. And I say that because if you watch Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, it kind of gives the impression that it could be more Western. So I suggest some of the books are very easy, quick reads. So another thing that Charles Eastman wrote, and the reason why I want to bring this in here is this is where he makes another connection between Native American spirituality, Christianity. And I think, again, this is important because of where Christianity has left behind nature. So he says the first again, I'm not going to pronounce that because I don't want to say it incorrectly, but that's basically their term for what we call a vision quest. And if you, that third word, if you translate directly, it actually says, it translates to mysterious feeling, which is more appropriate for the process. It's not a vision, it's a mysterious feeling, so it could be intuitive. So he says the first vision quest or religious retreat marked an epoch in the life of the youth, which may be compared to that of confirmation or conversion in Christian experience. So in a lot of modern religions, the steps that are laid out already are there in similar ways as Indigenous people, but they've completely dropped out the native connection and how we should be one with the earth and nature. So now looking at why we have this connection. Now the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is one of Jung's theories. And Jung says the collective unconscious is part of the psyche which can be negatively distinguished from a personal unconscious by the fact that it does not, like the latter, owe its existence to personal experience and consequently not a personal acquisition. The contents of the collective unconscious have never been in consciousness and therefore have never been individually acquired, but owe their existence exclusively to heredity. And this is from Roszak. So Roszak says, what lies at the core of the mind is an ecological unconscious, a repository for the compounded evolutionary history of our species, the repository of an evolutionary record that ties the psyche to the full sweep of cosmic history. Now, Roszak also says of the collective unconscious, he says, of all the theoretical apparatus we inherit from mainstream modern psychology, Jung's often elusive and always controversial notion of the collective unconscious may prove to be the most serviceable in the creation of eco-psychology. So we're establishing a very similar thing here, the idea of this ecological unconscious and the collective unconscious. We can't escape it. We can't escape it. It's in us all. So looking now, if this is in us all, if we've all got this history, this collective unconscious, that ecological unconscious, how do we tap back into it? What can we do about it? How can we use it? So I'm looking at now the Euro-Indigenous knowledge and alternative rituals. Now, one of the things for me, and this is why I have it in my little bio that I was born in Australia to Italian World War II refugees, basically refugees before there was even such a term, but that's what they were, is that I've got background in obviously Southern Europe and Australia as well, and my own experiences have been very, how could I word this, very eye-opening. I spent a lot of years overseas, and when I went back to Australia after almost 20 years, I really felt reconnected. Like I suddenly realized that a big piece of me was there. But there's also a big part of me in Southern Europe. For example, now both my parents are Italian. We knew on my mother's side that they originally came from France, but my mother didn't know anything about that when or anything more about that. So we weren't even 100% sure how true it was. So I did my 23andMe and I expected it to come up, you know, with 80% Italian, 20% bits and pieces of other things. Well, it ended up coming up about 38% Italian, about 36% French, and other bits and pieces from, you know, various other parts of the world. So there was this huge chunk of me that is French, and I always had this affinity with the French language and wanted to learn it. I never did, unfortunately, but I was wondering if that was part of this sort of unconscious connection to this way back history. And ironically, I also had about, I think it was 0.1% end up being Japanese. And I'm thinking, how the hell did that come along, 0.1% Japanese? Well, you think about it over history, the trade routes, well, somebody had a one-night stand there somewhere along the line, and I've still got 0.1% of that Japanese in me from the routes probably. So it's amazing how when you do a DNA check, when you start to look at where did I come from, what it can come up with. So the Euro-Indigenous knowledge, first of all, everybody has it. We weren't born in houses and made of brick and mortar. We came from some kind of tribe somewhere originally from the land. It's just the way it is. It's earth-based and it's unconscious. And there's also aspects of what they call a bicameral mind, which is two states of mind or two aspects of the mind. And there's two authors that write about that in a sense. Chetwynd was one, and I've got to put them in my reference in case anybody wants to read more about that. But they also talk about at what stage you can say the left mind overtook the left side overtook the right side, and they talked about this struggle between the two before the left overpowers the right, and we become more left brain orientated. And I always thought, the left brain, when I talk to people about it, it's ironic that it's the left side because it's probably the part we should have left behind a long time ago. Now, one thing about, Peggy talks about this in her book too, is about when we look into when we look into our background, is that it does become more and more complicated because of the settler societies, which I think is a great term, that there's a lot more cultures filtering into these sort of modern Western countries, and there's a lot more multiracial blending. So of EIK, Peggy writes, white privilege and entitlement has given us the erroneous idea that we can choose any path we want from any part of the world, and the attraction to our own ancestral roots is not particularly strong. We need to have a spiritual conversation with our DNA. And that is so damn accurate. Now, from my own experience, it was when I did my DNA check, it really blew me away, the bits and pieces that come up, stuff I totally didn't expect at all. And so that was an important start for me, and that really helped to sort of get me, I don't just want to say so much grounded and on the right path to sort of looking more into things. Now, because in a sense, I'm part of a settler society. I'm born in Australia. My parents come over from Italy. I do have a connection with Australia, but it's nowhere near that of Aboriginal Australians who, their connection is phenomenal. Like any Indigenous group of people, that's, especially, that kind of, when we're talking thousands of years of being on the one land, it's just unimaginable how that could be. And another thing that Peggy writes in her book, Peggy says, describing Canada and the United States, white supremacist capitalistic fantasies that have nothing to do with earth connection, and in turn have created a populace that has stronger ties to regional or national identity than to the land itself. You can include Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Zimbabwe, the list goes on and on and on and on and on from all these settler societies. And not only have we really damaged the Indigenous people, but in the same way, we've also don't even realize how much damage we've done to ourselves by not embracing our own Indigenous backgrounds, but also by not totally accepting, like 100% accepting that we're on other people's land and we're guests there. It's not ours. If you want to claim any kind of ownership, the ownership belongs to those Aboriginal people. So we have to start looking at alternative rituals. And as leaders in these fields, it is up to us to elucidate to those who come to us that using another culture's rituals is actually detrimental to our own well-being. So it's not just about saying, hey, you're stealing it, you're borrowing someone else's. It's really about saying, look, it's kind of like this. You have a gasoline running car, you can put in diesel in your car. You may think it's going to run, but it's not. It's going to break down. The car still looks the same on the outside, but internally it's breaking down. So you've got to tap into your own to begin with. So alternative rituals, and I'm just going to go through the main parts here. You can read this more afterwards if you want. This was from Jung, and this was to do with what he called imitation, when basically Westerners take practices of other cultures. He says people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls, all because they cannot get on with themselves and have not the slightest faith that anything useful could ever come out of their own souls. Very smart man, right? So alternative rituals. So when I started looking into my own background, this is what I found. And this was mind-blowing, and more as I get into it. So the Eleusinian and Dionysian mysteries, these came out of the Greco-Roman period, a period of classical antiquity. They are earth-based, polytheistic, transitional, and come from an oral tradition. They predominantly existed in this period in what we know as Greece and Italy from 700 BCE to 400 AD. However, there's a lot of scholars, there's basically universal agreement that these come from an agrarian culture, elsewhere, and there's a belief of them or signs of them or in Egypt, in the Middle East, other places of the Middle East, in Africa. So this kind of ritual may actually be as worldwide as we know it. And they actually say certain artifacts being found that demonstrate this practice that go back to 1600 BCE. So that's a long period of this practice, of this ritual to be around that we can tap into. And a lot of cultures can tap into this because of how wide it was spread. Now, a couple of things about this. Well, let me go back here a sec. I want to say something about oral tradition. With the mysteries, they were never written down. People, initiates as they call them, they were allowed to talk about their experience, but they weren't allowed to talk about the practice and how it was conducted. That was hence the mysteries. So there's very little information about exactly what was done during these practices. And unfortunately, it was sort of pushed out by, well, Christianity. Christianity came in, and a lot of scholars also say when they examine Christianity and what they know about the mysteries is that Christianity took a lot of the practices, a lot of things from the mysteries and adapted them to use in Christianity. Now, it's a pretty good way to get people to convert. But it doesn't have all those other things that we need. This is what we need. Christianity doesn't have these, or it's not. Let me rephrase that. It's not that Christianity doesn't have that, but it's shifted away from it. And a lot of people that are not just practicing, but are educating in these modern religious curiosity and lead these church leaders, they're not using it. They're not tapping into these things. They're remaining disconnected from the earth-based side of Christianity. So here's another great thing about these mysteries. They're 3 stages. They have descent, they have threshold, and have the incorporation. So again, it's very similar to the modern rites of passage. Now, I'm not going to read these out thoroughly. This is basically the last slide here. But this tells you more of different people have wrote about when you look, if you know the wilderness rite of passage and you read these things here, it really starts to tell you that the mysteries are very similar to what the rite of passage is about being connected to the earth, it's not about division, it's about transcendence and things like that. And the last thing, St. Clemens of Alexandria said, the knowledge of nature is taught in the great mysteries. And that is it, guys. Thank you. And I've got the references there. I'm actually I realized I didn't include Chetwynd and one other person who talk about the bicameral mind. I'll add those in as well for you. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to stop the recording.